I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're here together, Andrew. I was giving people just a brief, very brief overview of where your work is appearing right now.
Yeah.
And it'll be up for months. There's time to see it. But again, like everybody knows, pandemic's a weird time. If you guys want to fill your eyes with some incredible photography, we recommend getting out to the fence, whether it's on the East Side Trail or on the west side of town. There's two locations that are close to most folks here in Atlanta. And you, Andrew Feiler, have the twofer of a project that appears in both locations. And your project, I'm eager to hear you talk about it, and I'm sure the folks tuning in want to hear more on the Rosenwald schools.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here, and it is an honor to be on either fence, and it's really a double honor to be on both. I actually spent some time on Saturday morning visiting and really absorbing all of the work of these incredible artists on both the Georgia fence and the international fence. So Julius Rosenwald led Sears, Roebuck and Company from 1908 until his death in 1932. He turned Sears into the world's largest retailer of that era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause was what would later become known as civil rights. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery, becomes an educator and is the founding principal of the historically black college in Alabama, that originally known as Tuskegee Institute. And the two men meet in 1911. Now you have to remember, in 1911, it's before the Great Migration. That doesn't start until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. And public schools for African Americans at this time are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the schooling of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so in 1912, the two of them create this program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. And they reach out to the black communities of the South and they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be an active partner in your own progress, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, and labor. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate in establishing black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress, and get the white school board to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, because these will be public schools, then Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution toward construction of the school. And from 1912 to 1937, this partnership builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. And the program literally transforms America. There are two economists at the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago who've done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. And that gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement come through these schools. Medgar Evers went to a Rosenwald school. Maya Angelou writes in her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, about her time in an Arkansas Rosenwald school. Carlotta Walls Lanier and several of her fellow members of the Little Rock Nine that integrated Little Rock Central High School went to a Rosenwald school before they walked into history. And Congressman John Lewis, who wrote the introduction to my forthcoming book, went to a Rosenwald school. So I had never heard of this program until I met a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And when she told me the story, I was shocked that I had never heard this story. I am Southern, I am Jewish, I am a progressive. This story are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of this program? So I came home and I Googled it, And what I found was a number of books written on the topic, but there was no effort, no photo documentary. And so of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 survive. Only about half of those are restored. And in 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 program states and shot 105 schools. About half the work is exteriors, which tells the architectural narrative from 1 teacher school, 2 teacher school, 3 teacher, 4 teacher schools that were wooden structures. To the time you get to the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. The interiors tell the adaptive reuse narrative. Very few of the surviving schools are used for educational purposes. And then portraits of people that have these compelling connections to the schools. Former students, former teachers, preservationists. And so what's on the international fence on the East Side Trail are some of the interiors and exteriors. And what's on the West Side Trail are some of the portraits that are part of this project. So a book of this work will be published by the University of Georgia Press, February 1st, 2021. And the first week in March, the exhibition that will eventually travel the country will originate at the Center for Civil and Human Rights in downtown Atlanta.
Bravo. Glad to hear it. And it's great. Your introduction was answering questions that I was thinking of. I'm curious. Okay, so we found out how you came across this project, how it ties into your own personal history.
Yeah.
And so in terms of making it happen and starting this driving around and looking at these locations, which many are now totally transformed, how do you start making the connection for the portrait side of the project?
Yeah. So the thing that I had to do was, I knew this was an incredible story, but how do you tell it visually? And that's the question that you're asking. And I think that there's 2 important parts to the answer. What I started doing is I would venture out and I would do these test shoots. I went to Warm Springs. I went up to Bartow County, where the Noble Hill School is. The very last Rosenwald School happens to be in Warm Springs, Georgia. And there's one in Savannah, on the campus of Savannah State. And what I came back from those experiences with was recognizing that the buildings only told part of the story.
Yeah.
And so as I came, and the second thing that was important is my process is to read and shoot and read and shoot. And in reading the biography, Peter Astley, who's a direct descendant of Julius Rosenwald, wrote the definitive biography of Julius Rosenwald. And as I read that, I came across this unbelievable story. The program started with a test, a pilot, if you will, of 6 schools, all with very close proximity to Tuskegee, so that the folks at Tuskegee could keep an eye on the program.
Right.
And Booker T. Washington had photographs taken of the students and teachers out in front of their school. And they were sent to Julius Rosenwald, who was so moved by these photographs that he decided there to expand the program.
Wow.
And these photographs of students and teachers out in front of their school become part of the visual language of the history of the program. And it was because of that I decided to make this entire body of work black and white and horizontal, because that is the language of these buildings. It's the language of these historic photographs. And that was one of the core aesthetic building blocks of the project.
So Rosenwald was a philanthropist. Was he in New York or Chicago because of Sears? Yeah,
he's in Chicago, and he's extraordinarily innovative because there were 2 important pillars of his philanthropy. First, three pillars. So number 1, he's the son of Jewish immigrants who fled religious persecution in Germany. And he says he is so appreciative of America, to be welcoming of the Jews. But America, he says, cannot move forward if part of its people are left behind. He understood that how we treat the least of the least accessible of our citizens, or those who were had least access to the American dream,
Right.
were how we defined ourselves. And so that's how he zeroed in on civil rights as his core issue, because he recognized that the fate of Jews was similar to the fate of African Americans and similar to the fate of other minorities in America. So that was number one. Number two, he believed in self-help. It was an important pillar of how he and Booker T. Washington saw the world similarly. So this idea that that the community that was going to benefit had to be an active participant in the program was a huge pillar of not only how the program was designed, but why it was successful.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing was, he was the first major philanthropist to say all of the money should be given away within X number of years of his death. Now, this is something that's become very de rigueur today, right?
Sure.
Bill Gates has said this, Warren Buffett has said this.
Zuckerberg, right.
Bernie Marcus has said that he wants all the money given away within 15 years of his death. Julius Rosenwald said that the generation who helped create the wealth should benefit from that wealth. And so he mandated that all the money in the Rosenwald Fund should be given away within 25 years of his death. And in fact, it was given away within 15 years, and the fund shut down in 1948.
So as you're embarking on this journey and you're starting to photograph these locations, you're beginning to meet some of these people, maybe in and around Warm Springs.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you, as a photographer, start to realize, hey, I'm onto something here? This is going to be another book project. This has legs, essentially. There's so much here that befits a exhibition, a book length project, etc.
Yeah. So there is a school in Newberry County, South Carolina, called the Hope School. The state school superintendent in South Carolina at the time of the Rosenwald program was incredibly supportive of the Rosenwald program, and as a result, there were Rosenwald schools in all 61 counties in South Carolina.
Wow.
His family sold the land for what becomes the Hope School. His name was Hope. The school is actually named after him. They sold 2 acres of land for $5, effectively donated it for this school. And so the school was named by the Black community in his honor. Roll forward to the 1980s, and Ron Hope, a career Army officer, retires back to Newberry County, South Carolina. The school is in complete disrepair, and he takes it upon himself to single-handedly restore the school. This is the school that Ron Hope was the person who donated 6 desks and a potbelly stove that are in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. They come from that school.
Wow.
So Ron Hope, there was a historian of this program, Stephanie Deutsch, who's written a wonderful book on the history of the Rosenwald program, who's been incredibly helpful, and she introduced me to Ron Hope by phone.
Yeah.
So I go over, and Ron Hope was my very first portrait. And I show up to do his portrait, and he is wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap.
Yeah.
And I can't believe it.
Because you're shooting black and white.
I'm doing, but I'm going back to my car to get my lights, and I'm
Oh, man.
When I took that photograph, I knew that was the beginning of knowing that these portraits could be an incredibly powerful part of the entire program.
So there's a bit of a direction with your previous project at Morris Brown, and I'm curious as to where the interest for you comes from in these education-based projects, and specifically African American education that has, let's say, passed, like with Morris Brown shutting down, and you were photographing the kind of landscape and environment of that institution. And with these schools too, can you talk a little bit about how those projects connect in your mind or your
Yeah.
interest?
Yeah, I think, so there's a couple answers to that question. First and foremost, I have been an activist almost my entire life. I worked on political campaigns when I was in high school. I spent all of my summers working in Washington. I worked for Senator Nunn on Capitol Hill. I am very involved in the civic life of Atlanta as somebody who is active with folks who are involved in public policy. I serve on a number of not-for-profit boards. I helped start 12 different civic initiatives. And so as I've been a serious photographer most of my life, but about 10 years ago, I started down this path of taking my work more seriously and fortunately being taken more seriously. And what I realized in the course of going down that path, what I realized was that my values of civic engagement were such an important part of who I am that and invariably that would be reflected in my work. And what the first project came about when Morris Brown filed for bankruptcy. I thought, this is a hugely important story, right? It has race. Everything in the South has to be viewed through the prism of race. It has class, because Morris Brown College had become a college that focused on providing college access to children of families of lesser means. It had religion, because it was founded under the AME Church. Mm-hmm. And so I do what I do as a civic person. I looked at who was on the board, and there was a man named Sonny Walker who was on that board. Sonny Walker was a foot soldier of the civil rights movement. He was a professor at the HBCU in Pine Bluff, Arkansas during the civil rights movement. He trained the Little Rock Nine on nonviolence.
Wow.
And I called up Sonny. He and I had served at that point for a decade on a board together, the Board of Public Broadcasting Atlanta, a board I now chair. And I said to Sonny, okay, I've got this crazy idea, Sonny. Maybe I can do a photo documentary of this campus to help tell the story of the role of historically Black colleges. And Sonny called me back 20 minutes later and said, the college president is Stanley Pritchett. Here's his cell phone number. He's waiting for your phone call. And as I'm fond of saying, there are other photographers that could have shot that work.
Right.
But there was 20 years of social capital that allowed Dr. Walker and Dr. Pritchett to trust me to tell this very sensitive story.
Yeah.
And so that story became one of the importance of historically Black colleges, past, present, and future. Mm-hmm. And it became a story of the importance of education as the backbone of the American dream. And because the first taxpayer-funded school in America dates to 1644 in Dedham, Massachusetts, and the role of education at giving rise to the American middle class literally dates from before the United States of America. And so this story, Southern, Black, Jewish, progressive, is just such an incredibly compelling story that it wasn't that hard. But its own basic way, this story also is an opportunity for me to express my values through my art. Absolutely.
And I appreciate both projects and that you're bringing them to life. I think I want to try to hop into the camera roll and pull up a couple of pictures. They'll be super tiny at the top here. Let me see if I can pull it off again. All right, that didn't work. Let's see. Hold on. Okay. I put them in this camera roll and they're not showing up. That doesn't make any sense. So I loaded these in beforehand and now they're not appearing.
I'm glad I'm not the only one having technical difficulties.
These things, I airdropped them over and all 8 of them, I had 8 or 10 from both sides and then they're not here. I appreciate what you were saying specifically about Rosenwald schools, but I guess it works for Morris Brown too, that this on-ramp to the middle class, which is this education as being an on-ramp for the middle class, which is something that seems to have faded from the national discussion at the moment. Have you seen in your travels and in your studies and in your reading, what's the next answer? Where's this going?
If you go back to the narrative, I'll say 2 things. First of all, a critical statistic about historically Black colleges. There were originally about 120 historically black colleges. We're down to about 100. Those 100 colleges are 3% of colleges in America, but they represent more than 10% of African Americans who go to college and more than 25% of African Americans who earn degrees. So even though there are people, and I have had people who are African American and people who are white say to me, historically black colleges, their time has come and gone. They remain an essential on-ramp to the American middle class. So that's one important fact. But if I go back, if you trace the history of education in America, 1644, the first taxpayer-funded school, the Land Grant College Act, which creates colleges all across America. People listening to this program and watching this program went to land grant colleges.
Absolutely.
The Land Grant College Act passed in 1862. In the decades after this, predominantly after the Civil War, you have the formation of historically black colleges. The GI Bill, the educational provisions of the GI Bill, transform America from relatively poor to relatively prosperous. Brown versus Board of Education is one of the high watermarks of the civil rights movement. But what are we talking about today? College affordability, college access. And so in this crisis of that prevents people, or in crushing levels of student debt. And so in the end, if America is to continue on the promise of education, creating opportunity for all, creating opportunity for the American middle class, we have got to deal with this issue of how we fund education.
Absolutely, and there's no silver bullet, there's no magic potion to make it happen. And other than what we saw yesterday with people lining up for early voting here in Georgia.
Absolutely.
Not a political podcast or broadcast here, but get out and vote. Just exercise that right. Andrew, I would love to talk to you much longer about this. We're trying to keep these within a certain time segment. We appreciate your work, appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about it today. Urge everybody watching to go see Andrew's projects on both sides of the fence here in Atlanta, and to look forward to the book that's coming out on UGA Press, you said in February?
February 1st, the book will come out. It's called A Better Life for Their Children. Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America. The gracious and amazing introduction from John Lewis. And the exhibition of the prints that will open at the Center for Civil and Human Rights at the beginning of March.
Fantastic. Congratulations. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for joining in and watching. We'll be back here next Tuesday at noon with another ACP Spotlight Talk. Cheers, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael.
Cheers. Bye.